I think we can go ahead and get started. So I first of all want to say thank you to everyone for being here today and welcome. I'm really glad that you're all here with us. My name is Elizabeth McMentatenko and I'm a librarian here at UC Merced. And I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Donald Barclay, who is going to be giving our Library Faculty Author Series talk today. The Faculty Author Series showcases the latest research and scholarship by UC Merced faculty members. And if you'd like to be featured in a future Faculty Author Series talk, please let me know. For today, we're thrilled to have Donald here with us as part of the series. Donald is the Deputy University Librarian at UC Merced, and he has worked as an academic librarian since 1990, holding positions at New Mexico State University, the University of Houston, and the Texas Medical Center in Houston. And he's been at UC Merced since 2002, before it opened to students. Donald earned his bachelor's degree from Boise State University, and he also holds master's degrees in both English and Library and Information Science from UC Berkeley. While pursuing his education, he spent 10 summers working as a woodland firefighter, mostly as a member of the U.S. Forest Service hotshot crew. And Donald has written many articles and books through the course of his career on topics such as the literature of the American West, children's literature, and library and information science. His book, Fake News, Propaganda, and Plain Old Lies, How to Find Trustworthy Information in the Digital Age, was published by Rowman & Littlefield in June 2018 and spent 2 months as an Amazon #1 release. And his most recent book, Disinformation, The Nature of Facts and Lies in the Post-Truth Era, is being published by Rowman & Littlefield in spring 2022. And so we're so happy to have him here with us today. And I'm going to turn this over now to Donald.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And are you seeing my, hold on, seeing my, oh, I'm not seeing my PowerPoint. Hang on. Sorry. Oh, there we go. I think we're good. All right. So thank you all for attending today. So this is my book, and as Elizabeth mentioned, it's just been published just now by Rowman & Littlefield. It's out. I've actually held the book in my hands. And when you publish your book, it's always exciting to see a book with your name on the cover, but it's also a little scary because you realize, oh, I have to answer for all that stuff I wrote. So a little fear and trepidation to go with the happiness. Why is it not moving forward? So,
Donald, we don't see your PowerPoint. I just wanted to briefly say that.
That's not good. Hang on, sorry. I don't understand why it's not doing it. Well, while we're fixing this, I'll just go ahead and talk. So my book, Fake News, Propaganda, and Plain Old Lies, as Elizabeth mentioned, was published in 2018. And it was kind of inspired by all the talk about fake news that erupted during the 2016 presidential campaign and afterwards. And I always intended that book to be kind of a how-to book for people who were interested in learning how to deal with misinformation, disinformation. The book that just was published, Disinformation, is a little more philosophical. It's not so much a how-to as a how-come, and talking about why maybe the world is in this state of uncertainty about information. There's so much turmoil in our digital world here. And I don't think that I've exactly hit on some grand unified theory of why we are in the state we're in, but I think I raised some ideas that I think are pretty interesting. And while I was writing Disinformation, a couple of things happened. One of them was the pandemic, which of course, all kinds of information related issues with that about fake news and misinformation, disinformation. And then, of course, there was the 2020 presidential election, and the subsequent events at the Capitol building on January 6th that were very disturbing, and a lot of it was related to information, disinformation, and so on. And then another thing that happened on the day of the inauguration, that's a very sad day for my family because on that day, a member of our extended family took his life. And he was someone who had struggled a lot with depression and substance abuse and so on. But he had gotten I think he'd gotten mixed up with a lot of that kind of QAnon, misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theory stuff. And I'm not saying that fake news killed him, but I think it contributed to his decision to end his life. So the point there being is that misinformation and disinformation have really serious consequences, and they have political consequences and social consequences, and they can have really devastating personal consequences. So we're still trying to get our thing working here. So I'm going to go ahead and continue talking here, and hope we can get the images showing. So my book has 8 chapters, and I'm going to talk about chapter 3, which is it still not? I don't know.
We can see it now.
You can see now? Okay, good. All right, let me move forward. Oh, hold on. Are you seeing Bernie now?
Yeah, there he is.
All right. Okay. So these are the 8 chapters of my book, and I'm going to talk about chapter 3. And the title of that is Digital Utopias Lost, How the Conflicting Dreams of the Dawn of Cyberspace Diverged. And I'm going to really talk about how different, very optimistic ideas of this utopian kind of cyberspace turned out to be very different than what people expected. And I'm going to go quite a ways back by starting to talk about this guy, Vannevar Bush. In his lifetime, Bush was a really important intellectual in American society. He was an engineer. He had a doctorate in engineering that was jointly issued by MIT and Harvard. For a while, he was the chairman of the engineering department at MIT. He was president of the Carnegie Institute in Washington, D.C. So he was a well-known public intellectual. But in his lifetime, what he was really known for was he was the head of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, the OSRD, during World War II. This was a really important agency. He was the civilian chief of this research and development wing of the government. And they were working on weapons and equipment for the military to help them win the war. And they had something like 2,500 contracts during the war worth $536 million. So, you know, if you translate that to today's money, you're talking about billions of dollars. And they worked on lots of different things. They worked on weapons like the proximity fuse. And the proximity fuse, if you were on a ship or on the ground in World War II and you were trying to hit a fast-moving airplane, this was the best technology for doing that. And it was developed by OSRD. They also worked on penicillin. Now, penicillin was discovered and developed in Britain before the war, but they didn't know how to mass produce it. And OSRD figured out how to mass produce it. So thousands and thousands of troops their lives could be saved by penicillin. And of course, not just during the war, but afterwards, of course, penicillin was used to fight venereal disease. And of course, with penicillin and other antibiotics, you know, in the old days, people would get a scratch or a blister and die of a blood infection. Well, not with antibiotics. So OSRD worked on a lot of things like that. Bush was well known during the war. He was a celebrated hero to a lot of Americans because Americans were understanding, oh, science and technology are really important to the war. And this illustration of him on the cover of Time magazine, and for some of you folks who are younger, before the digital age, Time magazine was really important. Being in Time magazine and being on the cover of Time magazine was a big deal. It had a lot of influence in American society, really beyond the United States as well. So Bush being on the cover of Time is a big deal. And by the way, what they say underneath him there, I've written it out for you, but when they say science is G5, G5 is military terminology to describe civilian efforts to support military activities. So they're basically saying he's the general of G5. He's really important to the war. So towards the end of the war, Bush published an article called As We May Think. And it was published in July of 1945 in the Atlantic Monthly, which is kind of a highbrow magazine. If you were college educated, upper crust kind of person, you might read the Atlantic Monthly in 1945. And it was so popular, it was reprinted 2 months later in September of 1945 in Life magazine, which is a more general interest, everyday person kind of magazine. So, and as we may think, Bush kind of starts out by talking about wow, we've really done some great things to win the war here, us scientists and technologists. But he goes on to think about what's next. And he conceives of this idea he calls the Memex, which is an analog machine that was never actually built. It was just a concept. But the idea was that we'd have something called the Memex, and then scientists, like as pictured here, would have things like they'd have a camera that they strapped on their head with a shutter release in their pocket. So when they're doing their work, they could just take photo after photo after photo to record what they were seeing. And they would be able to record their voices. And you can't really see this, but on the right, I have those glasses is a little square for helping to direct the camera to make sure you're taking exactly the photo you want to take. And this is a mock-up of what the Memex might look like. It's all analog technology because digital technology did not exist. But the idea of the Memex was not only would you record things like your voice and pictures, but you would store it, you'd be able to retrieve it, and you could share it with other people, and you could access other people's stuff. And so when we read, as we may think from the perspective of the 21st century, even though he didn't have digital technology, we look at the Memex and go, oh, Bush totally got it. He's talking about desktop computers, he's talking about hypertext, the internet, and online encyclopedias and online information sources. He kind of nailed the internet before it existed. So I've read this essay a number of times. I first read it in 1989 when I was in graduate school. And one of the things I always ask about it is, what do you mean by we, Vannevar Bush? And I think he means two things. On one level, he means everybody. And at one point in his essay, he uses the word race, but not to mean like African, white, Asian. He means the human race. And he uses it quite intentionally because throughout his essay, as typical of the time, he uses the male pronoun as a default pronoun, he, him, his. But he says race because he means everybody, and he sees this technology as benefiting everybody, either directly as a user or indirectly, as someone who's going to benefit from what he sees very optimistically as all the great things science and technology are going to produce for us in a post-war world. Because by the time he was writing this essay, it was pretty clear that the Allies were going to win the war. It was just a matter of time. So he means everybody, but he also means something else. He means men of science. And I'm using air quotes here because that's what they would have been referred to as men of science, these men who were leading these efforts in science and technology. And this is a photograph of some of the scientists who worked for Bush and OSRD. And they're very prominent scientists. And they're meeting at the Bohemian Club in San Francisco. And if privilege is a cracker, the Bohemian Club is the cheese that goes on the cracker of privilege. It's a very exclusive place to be meeting. And these are all very prominent scientists, but I'll point out two of them for you. One of them is J. Robert Oppenheimer. You've heard of him. He worked on the bomb. And then Ernest Lawrence. And if you know about Lawrence Livermore Lab or Lawrencium, the radioactive element, that's the Lawrence they're talking about. So these are some prominent scientists. They are the men of science who are going to lead the world forward. They're winning the war at this point. This is 1942 when this picture is taken, but they're helping to win the war, and they're going to be leading technology forward in the future. And they're like rock stars. I mean, by the end of the war, these people were like rock stars. Everybody admired them. They were well known. In a way, if these guys are the Beatles, I know there's more than four, but if these are the Beatles, then Bush was like Brian Epstein or George Martin, you know, the guy who brought them all together and made it work. And there's some things about these scientists that you can't see in the picture, which is they're very similar in outlook. They have similar educations. Most of them have Ivy League or Oxbridge doctorates. They're mostly Anglo-Americans. Not all of them, but most of them are. They're mostly English speakers. And what you can see, of course, is that they're all white males and they all dress alike and they look a lot alike because they were the men of science. Now, when you write a book, there's two things you think about after you're done and it's published. You go, usually there's a couple of things you go, oh, I wish I hadn't said that. And then you think about, you know, I should have said a little more about this. And I wish I'd said more about this. These are the men of science, but it's important to point out as we get into the digital age with computer and internet, it wasn't just men of science and it wasn't just white men of science who were important. So I'm going to run through a few people I should have called out a little more in the book, but I didn't. Ada Lovelace, considered the first computer programmer. That's going way back. Grace Hopper, pioneer computer programmer. She developed some really important computer languages, and she was an admiral in the Navy. Evelyn Boyd Granville, the first African-American woman to be awarded a doctorate in math by a US university. She got her degree from Yale in 1949. She was a programmer for IBM, and then she was involved in the Apollo program, really important programmer. Melba Roy Minton, another programmer. She worked as a section chief at the Goddard Space Flight Center, which means Apollo Space Program. Elizabeth J. Feinler, who was an ARPANET pioneer. ARPANET became the internet. I'm going to talk about ARPANET more later. Really important computer scientist. Mary Ellen Wilkes, who worked on the Link computer, which is considered the first personal computer. Rada Perlman, who developed the technology that we now know as the Ethernet. And some people refer to her as the mother of the internet, although apparently she doesn't like to be called that. So anyway, they do call it that. So, and these aren't the only women, the only people of color who were involved in this. There were more, but I want to say it wasn't just white men, although the white men, Bush and his similar looking buddies, kind of took center stage. And so Bush wrote this essay, As We May Think, and it was really influential. It was influential for the people of his era, but it was also influential on a lot of up and coming scientists, including some of the women we just saw who were going to create the digital world. One of those people is Douglas Engelbart. And Douglas Engelbart was an enlisted sailor. At the end of World War II, he was in the Philippines right at the end of the war, and he read As We May Think in Life magazine. It inspired him to become an engineer, and he became a computer engineer, and he invented the computer mouse. You see it right there on his desk. Also, notably, and good for him, he was the person who recruited Elizabeth J. Feinler to work on ARPANET. So he brought some people in who weren't white males, who weren't part of Bush's we of elite scientists. Ted Nelson, he's kind of a character. He was inspired by As We May Think, and he coined some important terminology that we still use today. He was an important computer scientist. J.C.R. Licklider, really important in the development of the internet. He was the first real director of the ARPANET, which became the internet. And in 1962, he was going around talking about an intergalactic network of computers that basically prefigured the internet. He was talking about this in 62, a really important figure. He was, in his book, Libraries of the Future, he writes in the introduction about how he was inspired by As We May Think, and he dedicates the book to Vannevar Bush. So really influential. Now, in 1968, Licklider and R.W. Taylor, another really important internet pioneer who was also influenced by As We May Think, published this article called The Computer as Communication Device, and they published it in a popular magazine. It wasn't a journal article. This is for the average person to read. And it was actually illustrated with some cartoons. And the cartoon, it says, at a project meeting held through a computer, you can thumb through a speaker's primary data without interrupting him to substantiate or explain. And there were several cartoons like this. I almost shared one of them, but it was so incredibly misogynistically 1960s sexist, I couldn't do it. So you can look this article up online and look at the cartoon yourself, but I'm not going to share it. But Licklider and Taylor wrote, and you can see this, in a few years, men will be able to communicate more effectively through a machine than face-to-face. And if we learned anything during the pandemic, of course, is that, sure, communicating through a machine is just as effective as being face-to-face. Now, we're communicating through a machine right now, but we still know we have a ways to go before that, that statement that was written in 1968 becomes true. So you have all these scientists and engineers who are just full of confidence. They are, in the post-war world, they are still hugely admired and well-known, and they are really rock stars. And so what have you got? You've got all these improvements in medicine, scientific medicine. Within 10 years after the end of the war, science has conquered polio. Polio was a disease that put the president of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in a wheelchair. It was a dreaded, terrible disease. It's conquered with a vaccine. And I can tell you this, when Jonas Salk developed the polio vaccine, he wasn't getting death threats, and he wasn't being called a liar, and he wasn't being called an actor. He was a celebrated hero. You got the Green Revolution in the 50s, where farmers were able to produce far more food than they've ever been able to produce before. You got the space race, of course. That was the big one. And then you've got, all this technology for warfare, of course, and then you've got digital technology, which leads to computers and the internet. So scientists are doing all this great stuff, really optimistic about the future, just like Bush, and as we may think, they're going to save the world and make everything work just right. And what we're looking at here is a little bit of space race trivia. It's Snoopy dressed up in an astronaut suit, and he's holding an air conditioner unit, which they would carry till they got into the actual spaceship to take off. And it says flight safety on his little air conditioner. And it says all systems are go. And if you're not familiar with the space age, all systems are go was a catchphrase. And it meant everything's just right. And they would launch these rockets with people on board, and they would show it on TV, and they would wheel TVs into the classroom when people like me were little kids, and we would watch it. And Walter Cronkite would narrate, and it would be 3, 2, 1, 0. All systems are go, and the rocket would take off. So this was a very familiar phrase, and it expressed the confidence of science. Now, you might have noticed something. This bit of space memorabilia, it's for Apollo 13. If you know your space history or your Tom Hanks movies, you know that all systems were not go on Apollo 13. So maybe there's a little overconfidence at work here. Maybe their vision of the future wasn't quite going to play out. We'll see. This next slide is called an ARPA order. ARPA was Advanced Research Project Agency, and it was a Department of Defense agency, and its main purpose was to give grants to researchers in colleges and universities to do work related to defense. And this particular ARPA order is from April 15th, 1963. So it's fairly early. ARPA was founded in 1958. I was founded in 1958, so I was 4 years old actually when this order was given. I was almost 5, but I was 4 when this order came out. And what it is, it's granting money to the primary investigator. His name is down near the bottom there, is Dr. Licklider, Dr. JCR Licklider. And it's giving millions of dollars to the University of California, Los Angeles, and to another research university in Alameda County to do computer networking research. And to give you an idea, so in 1963, my family, we were a one-income family. My dad was the breadwinner. We lived a kind of a modestly middle-class life. My dad made $10,000 a year in 1963. This is a lot of money, a lot of money. So this, and one more thing about ARPA orders, one of our faculty members, Christian von Ferozen, is going to the National Archives. He's either gone or he's going soon, and he wants to look at all these ARPA orders to do some economic analysis of how this grant process funded technology in the early 60s. So Department of Defense funding, and so there's 2 stories here about the internet and how it was created, ARPANET and then the internet. The first story is Department of Defense was starting to use computers. They wanted their computers to be able to talk to each other in the event, any time, but especially in the event of a nuclear war. So their computers in Washington, D.C., and their computers in Omaha, Nebraska, and everywhere else they were could talk to each other. And they wanted a network that could not be taken out by a single bomb. So that story is they were funding this research, and that's why the internet take on the structure it takes, where everything is interconnected. And so if you're sending data over the internet and there's a blockage, something is down, the data just goes around through a different route and ends up where you want to send it. And it makes the internet really robust and reliable. It's a really strong feature of the internet. So that's one story. It was a Department of Defense project. The other story is people like Licklider knew that the Department of Defense had a lot of money to spend, a lot of grants to give out. So if you could make your research project in any way relate to defense, you could go to ARPA and get money to do your research. So in that sense, it really was an academic project. It was faculty and grad students and postdocs, some military, some business people, but mostly academics in higher education working on how do we get computers to talk to each other effectively. And they developed the ARPANET. And the ARPANET was launched in '66. This is a drawing of it in '69, but it really hadn't changed in those 3 years. So you had SRI, which is Stanford Research Institute in the north of California, UC Santa Barbara, UCLA, and then the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. And you had scientists working on how do we send messages back and forth between these computers? How do they all talk to each other? And they developed this technology, TCP/IP, which is how the internet still works today. Right now, when I'm talking to you, we're using TCP/IP. That's how it works. And that was the basis of ARPANET, which became eventually the National Science Foundation Net, NSFNet, in 1981. And NSFNet was an advance because it brought in a lot more academics. ARPANET was pretty much just these hardcore computer research types. NSFNet brought in a lot of other researchers, biologists and librarians, and even social scientists and humanists. And so it made a much bigger internet community, but it was still an academic community. It was North American academic community. And NSFNet until 1993 was isolated. It existed by itself. So you couldn't really talk to other networks outside of NSFNet. The other thing about NSFNet was that it was, one of the things about it was purely a research network, and you weren't allowed to do any commercial activity. So when I started using NSFNet in the late 80s and into the 90s, I even remember like somebody would share a book review and some people would come back and go, oh, you can't do that. That's advertising your book. It's not allowed on NSFNet. Yeah. Anyway, NSFNet became the internet. And like I said, it was isolated. Now in the late 80s, early 90s, some private networks got started. Bitnet, which was an IBM network, AOL, Prodigy, CompuServe, and you had some networks in other countries as well. Other countries were doing computer networking, but the United States was really the big player in the game, and NSFNet was the bulk of the internet in the days that it existed. And this is a map of the NSFNet in its early days, and of course it grew a lot bigger than that. So you've got NSFNet, and then in the early 80s, computers start moving into everyday life in a big way. And so you've got Time Magazine. Every year, back in the day, Time Magazine would have its Man of the Year. Now they have a Person of the Year. But in 1982, instead of having a Man of the Year, they had Machine of the Year. It was the personal computer. So they were starting to come into people's lives. I got my first personal computer in 84, I think, or 85, somewhere in there. And like a lot of people, my personal computer, my first one, I didn't have it hooked up to the internet. Not everybody did. A lot of people were just using them as word processors and spreadsheet machines and playing games. But a lot of people were getting hooked up to the internet too. It was starting to become part of everyday life. December 1990, first web page. This is not actually the first web page, but it looked a lot like this. The web took a while to take off because in part it started out really small. Nobody really knew about it. It wasn't being promoted very much. And the early browsers were kind of tricky to use. I remember using an early browser called Cello that was a bit wonky, you know. So it was a little wobbly when it started. 1991, the Gopher was launched. And the Gopher was a hypertext menu-driven way of accessing the internet. It was all text and menus. So for example, here, if you type number 4, you would go to another menu that would list maybe a bunch of games, and then you type another number, and then you'd be able to maybe download a game using FTP. You could download images and videos, although videos were very difficult because the bandwidth was so slow. But you could download videos or images from the Gopher, but then you could only see them and play them on your hard drive. You couldn't see them online the way you can on the web. So it's very text-based. I did a ton of work on the Gopher back in the day, creating Gopher pages and putting up documents and menus and so on. It was a big deal. Okay, Scientific and Advanced Technology Act of 1992. This was a big deal. And it did a number of things, but it did two really big things. It said the NSFNet, you can do commercial activity on it now. And it said the NSFNet will connect to other networks. So this meant now that NFSNet could connect to things like Bitnet and AOL and so on. Okay, 83, Mosaic browser. This was the first widely adopted successful browser that really made the World Wide Web start to take off. And, you know, I remember some guy in the library, our tech guy, coming to me and saying, hey, you got to come see this thing, and I don't think it was Mosaic, I think it was Cello, but it was fairly early on, and oh my goodness, that's really amazing. So then it took a while for the networks, the private networks to connect to NSFNet. But in September of 1993, which is known as Eternal September, America Online connected to the NSFNet. And believe me, a lot of the old timers didn't really want those people to go away. So AOL was the most popular private network. And the way they made it work was they would send, initially back in the day, they would send these floppy disks that had free time on AOL, and you'd put it in your machine and you get to use AOL, and then you would subscribe, right? And if you don't know what a floppy disk is, ask your Nana. And then more famously, they would send CDs. And I must have gotten 100 of these sent to me, these CDs for free AOL time. I never used them. If you don't know what a CD is, ask your pop, he'll tell you. I just read this fact this morning, of all things, that said in the 1990s, half of all the CD discs manufactured were AOL discs. That's how many they gave away. At their peak, AOL had 25 million users. And I've heard that that there's still people who have AOL accounts that they never canceled. And AOL still makes money. People are paying $10 a month still to belong to AOL, and they haven't used it in decades because they never canceled. So you had all of these people on AOL. A lot of them were really new, didn't know what they were doing, didn't know the rules and customs and traditions of this very academic country club that we called the NSFNet. That was all of these academics who were all behaving themselves and following the rules. And all these maniacs came into our country club, and they're driving their carts on the greens, and they're leaving their divots, and they're shotgunning beers, and they're just driving us all crazy. So we had to do something, right? So people started producing what they called Netiquette guides. And Netiquette is a portmanteau word, and it means network and etiquette. And the idea was, well, these people who are acting wrong on the internet, these newbies, if we just tell them what the rules are, they'll read it and they'll understand, because they're reasonable people like us, and everything will be fine. And as you know, publishing these Netiquette guides, after that, there was no more turmoil on the internet and everything was fine, right? No, not quite. So there were lots of Netiquette guides, and even books on Netiquette. I edited a book that had a chapter on Netiquette in it way back. That was the first book I ever did. So I'm going to jump ahead to 2000. So this is Time Magazine again. This is January 1999. Everybody was worried about Y2K. All the computers were going to stop working, and civilization was going to grind to a halt. But you can see that the network, the internet, was big enough to be on the cover of Time Magazine by the year 2000. And I suspect this is 1999. If you'd gone back 5 years before this, in 1994, and you'd walk down the street of any American city and asked people, have you ever sent an email? Have you ever been online? Most of the people would have said no. By the time this was published, most of them would have said yes. So the world of the internet had expanded. This country club had taken on a lot more members and more diverse. They weren't just a bunch of nerdy academics. In 2000, though, it was still a pretty insular world. In the year 2000, almost 75% of all the internet users in the world were from North America, primarily the United States. Almost 80% of the internet users had English as their first language in 2000. That seems hard to believe, but that's the fact. 95% of the internet users in 2000 were from a country with a UN Development Index of high. They're from wealthy countries. 73% were from a country in the top 20 GDP. So they were mostly North American, strongly English speaking, mostly from wealthy countries. If you went online in 2020, chances are anybody you interacted with was going to be more like you than they were different from you. And I'm going to illustrate what I mean here with a little clip from a Monty Python skit. I'm not going to show the whole skit. So if you look at the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, it will show you that the first recorded written use of the word spam to mean unsolicited internet communications was 1991, which means the word was being used outside of writing before then. It was being used in spoken language before then. How long before, we don't know. And the thinking is that This Monty Python's clip that I'm going to show you part of is the source of the word spam, meaning unsolicited messages. Okay, so this is a Monty Python sketch that was first aired in 1970 on the BBC. It was repeated on the BBC, and then it was on public broadcasting in the United States starting in the 70s, in the mid-70s, and was repeated time and time again. And the point here is that if you'd gone to a computer person in 1992, like me in 1992, and I heard the word spam for the first time, and I said, where did this come from? Why do we call this stuff spam? And somebody said, oh, the Monty Python skit. Chances are that computer nerd would have gone, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. I've seen it. And I'm not saying that every computer person in 1992 was a Monty Python fan, although most of us were. Most of us knew about this stuff because we saw the world through a similar lens. We had a very similar cultural view. We probably were English speakers, and we had a lot of similar cultural touchstones, which made for a lot of uniformity. So even though there were a lot more people than there had been earlier, the computer world of 2000 was still I'm jumping ahead, 2000 was still a fairly homogeneous world. And what that means is that it was a lot easier then for the cyberspace to be a place with a lot of civility and consensus and cooperation and general peacefulness, because when everybody's kind of alike, it's easier to maintain those things. When people get more diverse, well, you get a lot of good stuff from diversity, but you also get some conflict. And you get things like this. Articles, this was published in 2019, the people who developed the internet, the computer scientists, who had all these great expectations and this utopian view of what all this knowledge and communication was going to do, we're sorry we did it, because you had stuff like this. You have a lot of hate speech. You have a lot of angry people. You have people overthrowing democracy, threatening people, some nasty stuff happening, right? And not just that, you have state-sponsored disinformation. That's not very utopian. And this is a very optimistic statement from Bush, as we may think. Presumably, man's spirit should be elevated if he can better review his shady past and analyze more completely and objectively his present problems. That's a very optimistic statement by Bush. But jumping ahead here, so we have cyberspace really coming on in the early 90s. And what we have are a couple of optimistic utopian visions of cyberspace in its early days that diverge from each other. The first of these visions is pretty well stated and actually kind of laid down in this document from the Progress and Freedom Foundation, which was a conservative think tank. And this was their Magna Carta, and it's basically what a cyber libertarian view of cyberspace. That cyberspace should be a place without government regulation. It's a place for capitalism to flourish. The free market should dominate. Basically the only rule here is there are no rules. And it's a place where plucky entrepreneurs like Gates and Jobs and the Google boys and Bezos and Zuckerberg will be able to grab this technology by the horns and make money and create opportunities and bring services and bring goods to people, because the free market was going to, be unhindered. And that's what cyberspace is for. It's for these plucky entrepreneurs to make these great new economic powerhouses. And so what you have are these internet entrepreneurs and geniuses joining Bush's elite we of scientists. And you might notice something. There's some kind of there's a slight similarity between all these internet pioneers and Bush's and his fellows. You might have noticed it. And things like Bitnet are definitely the children of this way of thinking. Bitnet separates currency from banks and states and creates this kind of libertarian currency that's not regulated by anybody. Now, there's great optimism about this. And one part of the optimism early on was, the great thing about the internet is it's all diverse, right? Because you can't blow it up with one bomb. So governments can't control the internet. It's a free place. Well, we know from things like the Great Wall of China and lots of other government things that the government, in fact, can control cyberspace. The other thing is it's going to be a great free market where anybody compete, except that you get these big monopolies which aren't so keen on competition anymore because they want to control the market, right? So some of these visions didn't really play out. Okay, diverging vision. This is the Amateur Computerist. It was a publication that came out of Columbia University in New York, and it was a cyber liberal view of what cyberspace should be. Cyberspace was a publicly funded thing. It was government grants built this. It was academics, professors, faculty members working in universities, mostly public universities, but all nonprofit universities, built this thing for the good of everybody. If you look at bullet number 4, volunteer contribution, no personal profits from contributions freely given by others. Holy cow, what would your average Silicon Valley billionaire and millionaire say about that? They wouldn't like it, right? This is a very different view. This is a view of cyberspace as a public works project like Hoover Dam or the interstate highway system. It's for the good of everybody. And if you have this view of cyberspace, not as the place of plucky entrepreneurs, but government-funded research producing good for everybody, a cooperative project, you go online and you see people selling ideas and products that quite literally attack the government that created the internet that they're on, academics, science, higher education, technology. It's a great irony. It's like if you look at this, you go, well, how can you do this? You don't even know your own history of this place you're on. So you've got these very competing views of what cyberspace should be, a liberal view and then a kind of a libertarian view. And there is this thing called the California ideology, which is sort of an attempt to bring them together. You've got sort of the liberal hippie, let's all be communal and work together because it's all cyberspace. And then you've got the libertarian, no government, let's make money view. And there's a scholar, I'm going to read this bit to you, named Michael Bozis. He's a media scholar, and in his dissertation, he kind of summed it up pretty nicely. The cultural liberalism of the new communalists who celebrated individualism and creativity, and the free market fundamentalists on the American right who celebrated competition and commerce collided in the cultures of technological innovation centered around Silicon Valley and Northern California. The ideals of the counterculture would be used to sell products and a better future to the first to Americans and then to the rest of the world. In the process, proving that free markets and private entrepreneurship could grow prosperity and fulfill the promises of democracy without the aid and regulation of the state, all the while ignoring that the networking technologies may never have been developed without the funding of the government and the work of institutional academics in the first place. I'm going to show another clip. This is the final scene from the television series Mad Men. And if you're not familiar with the series, the main character is this guy named Don Draper, who throughout the series has been this button-down Madison Avenue corporate advertising executive. And he's selling cigarettes and alcohol and cars and Kodak film and in this very buttoned-down kind of misogynistic, uptight world dominated by white men. And he gets tired of it. And in the end, he goes off to join a commune on the West Coast. This is about 1969 or 1970. He's thrown off corporate America. And here he is on the West Coast in this commune. Goes to the West Coast and tries to adopt this counterculture view of the world, but he realized, oh, this is just another way I can sell stuff. And the implication is he goes back and creates this famous Coca-Cola commercial. So you've got this idea of this being a place of, it's supposed to be the cyber liberal view of this communal place, and you can sit there and scoff and scorn at Google and Facebook and all these big corporations are making money. But you know what? If you need to buy meditation accessories, Amazon Prime has free shipping, next day delivery, great prices, and a really great selection. It's hard to resist, isn't it? So you've got, again, the idea is you've got this mixed foundation of these two views of what cyberspace is supposed to be. And is it any wonder we have so much conflict in this world? Because these are really ideas that don't live together all that well. Now, Office of Scientific Research and Development. I mentioned a couple of things they worked on. that were under the control of Bush. This is another thing that was under Bush's control. Bush was at Alamogordo when they tested the first atomic bomb, which they called the gadget. Bush was standing right next to J. Robert Oppenheimer when Oppenheimer famously quoted the Bhagavad Gita and said, "I am become death, destroyer of worlds." This means that when Bush published his article, when he was writing it, when he published it in Atlantic in July of 1945, so it's July 1945, Germany had surrendered in May, in the first week of May. The Japanese were still fighting. When Bush wrote his article and when it was published, he knew something that very few people knew. He knew the atomic bomb existed, and he knew it was going to be used, and it was going to be used on people and very soon, in August of 1945. So in writing his article, and by the way, when it was published, by the time it was published in Life magazine, everybody knew about the atomic bomb. It was out there. So that means that Bush had this optimism about the future, and he had this vision that really became the internet. But he also had this terrible secret. He knew that there were these terrible things about technology. And that's why, along with his very optimistic statement in As We May Think, he had this less optimistic statement in which he says, more or less, we have this great technology and it may help us grow in the wisdom of race experience. And he means help us to become a better human race, a better people. All this information, all this knowledge will help us be better. Unless it causes us to terminate the process, effectively to destroy ourselves, or to lose hope that we can get something good out of it. And that's kind of what, this is the end of my talk about my chapter, but it's sort of what I leave you with. I think we are at a turning point in our society, in the world society. We've got this technology, we're using it. We know it can be used for good, but we know it can be used for some really bad things. And look no further than what's going on in Ukraine and the disinformation that's going on in that war, the weaponization of information, really dangerous, really scary stuff. But it's got all these great things too. And we are in the balance now, and it's really up to us as a human race, where are we going to go forward with this? And I'm kind of an optimist. I hope we're going to go forward and do great things, but I can't say for sure. And only time is going to tell us how we're going to do with it. So that's the end of my presentation here. I'll stop sharing, and maybe there's some questions from outside or.
Thank you so much, Donald. That was really interesting. I want to just also repeat that, and I'm seeing some people are clapping, which is great. I also wanted to just repeat, if you do have questions, feel free to unmute yourself, or I know there are some people in person, or you can put stuff in the chat, but I'll stop talking for a second so people can ask questions. And if folks are typing, while we're waiting, I was kind of curious, do you think there's any point where they could have gone somewhere differently or made it so we didn't end up where we are today?
Well, I think, I don't know, we could have, because, I mean, my read on it is there never would have been an internet without all these academics working, the internet was a government-funded research project for 20 years. It was, and people criticize it. Al Gore famously got a lot of heat for saying I invented the internet. But in a way, well, he didn't actually say that, but he was really fundamental in keeping funding going to the internet when he was a congressman. And there were a lot of congressmen who were going, this is a waste of money. We shouldn't be spending money on this. It's just a waste of time. But Gore and other people saw the advantage of it, and they kept putting money into it, millions of dollars. And it took all that basic work to get it to a point where it was functioning really well. And as much as someone might go, well, gee, I kind of miss the old days of the NSF-net when it was all just a bunch of us academics being nice to each other. It got to a certain point, but I think it really did take the genius of entrepreneurs and the kind of money that could come from that to really make it greater, to bring in all these things we have, like Zoom right now, I don't think we probably wouldn't have Zoom if it was still a public project, waiting for money with the ups and downs of the economy. And we're not going to give you as many millions this year. You're going to have to tighten up your belt, and maybe next year we'll give you more. That's a hard way to go forward. The capitalistic part of it, which certainly has its downsides, also created a lot of these tools that we use and can use for really good purposes, but they can also be used for really, really bad purposes too. So I think it was kind of inevitable. And we certainly had people who had really different views. The cyber liberal and the cyber libertarian views of what cyberspace is going to be. And even though people tried to marry them the way Don Draper kind of tried to marry the counterculture with being a corporate executive, they don't marry very well.
Thank you. I see, Olivia, you opened your video. So did you have a question?
Well, I put it in the chat box. Just basically, thank you for including the oft neglected history of women in tech. I really did appreciate that. As we all know, what Crick and Watson discovered, right? Rosalind Franklin's notes. So, so here is my new avatar, and it just got, after listening to your talk, which that was fantastic, by the way. I am wondering how far we are from a time where you can create a real-time avatar that you can't tell from the real thing. So I could be on here as a blonde-haired, brown-eyed man, and nobody would be able to tell the difference.
Oh, I think we're there. There's certainly deepfake technology now that's out there that's quite accessible. And of course, what's it being used for? Mostly pornography, but unfortunately, pornography seems to lead the way on so many technologies. I mean, if you go back to the history of the internet, but it's with that kind of deep fakes and using artificial intelligence. No, I think it's going to be really easy for people for me to appear as a Black woman or as an Asian man or whatever. I think we're really there. Just technologically, it's just probably some tweaking before we start seeing it more.
Be a raccoon.
Okay.
Donald, this isn't a question, but I think I was struck by the Netiquette piece that you shared back in 1995, and this idea that they already had to tell people to stop sending flames. Like, in some ways it feels like, yes, it's bad, but it's always had some of this element.
Yeah, although, compared to the stuff you see in the last 10 years, it was mild, the Netiquette, one of the things that kind of set off this Netiquette was something called the Great Spamming of 1994, which is where this law firm sent thousands of spam messages about a green card service they were offering to try to get green cards for immigrants to the United States. And people, the old guard of the NSFNet, lost their minds. They were calling this law office and jamming their phone lines and filling up their mailboxes, and people were just outraged that these people were advertising, and actually by that time it was legal to advertise on the internet. It was no longer the NSFNet, no commercial activity allowed, but people still got upset. And you think about that now, oh, gee, they sent out advertisements for green cards, compared to some of the stuff you see now, it was really pretty mild. And certainly you can find examples of really bad behavior from back then. There was a famous thing called alt.rec.tasteless, which is this group that liked tasteless humor. And this was back in the Usenet days. And they invaded this other Usenet group called alt.rec.cats. And they started acting like they were interested in cats. And then they started exchanging recipes for cat and things like that. And the cat people on the Usenet group didn't know what hit them. It was really quite a scandal at the time. This was probably 1992 or so. And it was a pranking, basically a trolling of this cat fanciers group. And by the way, I have 2 cats. I love cats. I do not advocate eating cat in any form. But that was the kind of that was really one of the first well-known acts of trolling on the internet, where you're just trying to say things to get people worked up for the fun of watching them go lose their minds. And the cat people, these poor unfortunate souls, didn't know what hit them, because nobody had really seen anything like that before.
Thank you. I'm still looking to see if there are other questions. It looks like Haipeng, you have a question.
Yeah, I do. So Donald, you just mentioned deepfake issue. I think it's a very popular topic now that everybody's talking about. And certainly that can be used for very good things, but also it can be used for very negative things as well. And it sounds like there's some commercial corporate kind of developments in handling these kinds of things, but it's pretty sophisticated, and it's pretty, going forward very aggressively. You might wonder, where all of this that's happening so quickly and so widely, where is it going to go eventually? How are we going to be able to control some of these things, particularly in negative directions?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question, because deepfakes have two problems. First of all, somebody could make a deepfake of, let's say, deepfake of me doing something really terrible, use your imagination, and people might see it and believe that Donald did something terrible, Donald cooking cat, to make something up that I would never do, that's terrible. And people might see it, and I could go out and say, that wasn't me, that was a deep fake, but not everybody would get that message. And some people might go on thinking Donald is this terrible person. That's one bad side of it. The other side of it is, suppose I did something really bad. Suppose I really did cook a cat and somebody had video of it and it was out there. And I go, oh, that's just a deep fake, don't believe it, the mayor, there's a video of the mayor of Los Banos receiving a $10,000 bribe, and he's talking about how he's going to spend the money on drugs. And it's a real video, but the mayor goes, oh, don't believe it, it's just a deep fake. And people believe that because they want to believe the mayor's a good guy. I mean, that's the other side of it. It undermines confidence in information, and it just makes this whole very disturbed, very contentious information environment we live in right now even more uncertain of what you can believe and what you can't believe. And we've seen that, of course, for a long time. We've seen fake Photoshop images; those have been really common for a long time. And now we're just going to get very much more sophisticated. And it's the latest technology they have is really easy to use. I haven't not used it. I've just read about it. Apparently, it's very, very easy to use and very easy to get your hands on. And just about anybody can do pretty convincing deepfakes with it. Now, I also understand there's some fairly sophisticated technology that can tell you if something's a deepfake or not, but you got to kind of run it through the machine. The average person looking at it is going to believe that they saw Donald cooking a cat and not a deepfake, unless somebody runs it through and says, oh, wait a minute, that was fake.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions right now, but I know we have, and I'm seeing a comment from a societal perspective. The real negative impact of deepfakes is the undermining of trust in institutions, which I definitely think is true. We have maybe like 30 more seconds if you want to address that.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's what I'm getting at. It becomes easy for somebody to do something bad. Like, for example, a video of police beating on some unarmed person. Oh, that's a deep fake. The police say they didn't really do that. Okay, well, I like the police, I'm going to believe it's a deep fake. Well, I don't like the police, I'm going to believe it's real. Again, this divergent world. So, it just makes it harder to know what to believe. And I guess we're running out of time here, but I do want to say one last thing. No cats were harmed in the writing of my book or the making of my talk. So if anybody tells you I ever hurt a cat, I did not ever hurt a cat. I love kitties.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you so much to everyone for coming today. And thank you. I hope everybody has a great rest of your day.